Hello, my name is Morgan Phillips. I work 2 days a week at Global Action Plan on the education elements of our consumerism and wellbeing work. I'm also co-director of a charity called the Glacier Trust and act as a trustee for National Association of Environmental Education and as an advisor to Green Schools Project. I was due to give this presentation at the end of our Anti-Black Friday event, which was run by Global Action Plan and Reboot for the Future, but last time got the better of us. So with the benefit of hindsight, I'm going to run through that presentation on this video now. At the start of the event, we heard from Tom Crompton from the Common Cause Foundation, who explained how important a link there is between the values we hold and our connection to bigger than self issues, and therefore our participation in typical environmental, community and social justice behaviours. Very briefly, what he explained to us is that if we strongly value things like wisdom, helpfulness, equality and unity with nature, which we call intrinsic or compassionate values, and we aren't as attached to things like how powerful we are, our financial wealth and our public image, which are all examples of more extrinsic values or self-interest values, then we're likely to be more engaged and committed to environmental and social justice behaviours. We also heard from a clinical psychologist, Ellie Hansen, who explained the links between values and children's well-being. She was noting how promotion of extrinsic values can, in some cases, have negative impacts on children's and adults' emotional well-being, but how conversely, how being in an environment where intrinsic values, those compassionate values, are more prominent, has a positive effect on well-being, or certainly tends to. And then we heard from Rob Bowden from LifeWorlds Learning, and he took us through the longitudinal work schools can do with children to learn through values and develop a school environment where the values the school community has identified as most important to them can be nurtured and woven into every aspect of school life. So, as environmental educators, we're beginning to develop our knowledge and understanding of the role values play, not just in the pursuit of environmental and social justice goals, but also in the well-being of children, which, given that the OECD reported this week that school children in Britain are more likely to be miserable and less likely to think that their lives have meaning compared with children in other countries, seems particularly relevant right now. And this leads us to a big question that we're looking to convene interested parties in a project around, to ask and hopefully start to answer this question. What does environmental education look like when we apply what we know about values? We want to turn what we're learning about values into something practical, which can hopefully develop our knowledge and understanding a bit further. We're looking for 10 organisations to join us on a 1-year action learning project who will form 2 distinct but overlapping groups. GAP and Reboot the Future will lead the charge in finding the funding for this project and will ensure those involved have access to all the expert support they need. In this presentation, I'm going to give a bit of background to explain the rationale for these 2 groups and what they might be doing. There is a potential third group too, that would look at the longer term engagement with schools, of the sort Rob shared with us earlier. Whilst we're not completely closed off to this idea, we're very aware that opportunities to engage in this way with schools are much harder to create. So for now, it's unlikely that we'll try to establish this third group, although we might look to do it in the future. We're going to concentrate initially instead on educators who have shorter term, sometimes one-off engagements with young people in formal and informal settings. Although these engagements are shorter term, they shouldn't be underestimated. They can still have a significant impact on children's lives, especially when they are part of a collective effort by an ever-expanding environmental education sector. Group 1 is best suited to organisations who design and deliver environmental education as an outside provider, i.e. those of us who deliver environmental education in its kind of conventional sense. This is education that is about the environment, which usually has a goal of being for the environment in some way, in that we hope it will bring about some sort of change in understanding of an issue like climate, biodiversity, water, litter or waste, and will lead to a change in attitudes or behaviour in relation to these issues, which is in some way positive. I'm simplifying a little bit, but this is environmental education that happens in classrooms, but also in playgrounds and nature reserves, education centres and so on. Now, we do need more education about the environment, much, much more. And the urgency of climate breakdown and the ecological crisis is grabbing the public consciousness. And more organisations and educators are popping up to deliver it, which is great and they're very welcome. However, as we're learning from people like Tom and Ellie and Rob, we need to be really mindful of the values that we are activating and reinforcing when we're designing and delivering environmental education. Group 1 is focused on developing that mindfulness. This is a map of the values we all hold, and it sometimes looks like this as well. It's the result of decades of research by academics from all over the world. Schaumann Schwartz created this map. The values aren't randomly scattered. They are close together if they are closely related and far apart if they're not. If you exercise a value like true friendship, you strengthen it, and when you do, this has a bleed-over effect to strengthen related values like meaning in life. Also, by exercising and strengthening these values, you weaken values that are distant and opposite from them, which, as Tom explained, is a seesaw effect. So strengthening true friendship values weakens something like social recognition. Recognising that someone wants to be your friend because they like you for who you are, rather than just because you're the cool kid who is popular in school, is a light bulb moment that many children have in some point in their life. And it strengthens the value that they attach to true friendship, while weakening the importance they place on social recognition. The universalism and benevolence values in the top right-hand corner of the map are referred to as intrinsic values, the compassionate values. Down in the opposite bottom left-hand corner, we find the extrinsic values, the more self-interest values. Imagine a school where intrinsic values are prominent, where you can feel that friendships are meaningful, where inequality is deliberately addressed, where children and teachers are wise and humble. Now imagine arriving at that school to deliver your environmental education workshop, a conventional one, educating about wildlife conservation, for example. Being mindful of values means that you position your workshop in the top right-hand corner where it reinforces the intrinsic values that are already prominent and maybe activates a couple more, which further strengthens their neighbours through that bleed-over effect. It's important to remember that whether it is your intention or not, you are an influence on the values of those you are engaging with. Your teaching materials and programs are too. It's inevitable, it's inescapable. You'll have your own view on which values you want to be activating and reinforcing when children and teachers encounter you and your resources. For me and for GAP, we'd prefer it if we were activating and reinforcing those intrinsic values. We're not always successful at doing this. Appeals to or reinforcement of extrinsic values do sometimes slip in. But the first step in our own development is to be aware of the impact we're having in relation to values. That's the process of actively assessing your own work and reflecting on it. And this is one of the things we expect Group 1 will be doing. Now imagine a few weeks later, another environmental educator goes into that same school that you've just been to. School that you'd worked with in a kind of symbiotic way, where you had been taking care to reinforce the intrinsic values that the school had been so carefully nurturing. Imagine if they landed their environmental education here. What effect might that have? They might be appealing to these sorts of values. It wouldn't be something the children and teachers were necessarily used to. And in doing it, they might, because of the seesaw effect, start to weaken some of the intrinsic values that you'd activated and reinforced a couple of weeks before. Right, now not all schools are going to be imbued with the intrinsic values. In the real world, there's certainly schools that have extrinsic kind of Black Friday values running through them. We've all been to these sorts of schools. The temptation on encountering a school like this is to do this. Now, it might allow us to get a few quick wins. We might appeal to things like concerns about money, status, social recognition, to try and nudge schools, teachers, children, parents to change a specific behaviour, e.g. energy saving to save some money, or the achievement of a award or a kite mark to help the school stand out to an Ofsted inspector. It's an understandable temptation. We've probably all done this. I know I have, but it never sits too comfortably with me because I know deep down the effect that the activation and reinforcement of those self-interest extrinsic values is having on the well-being of the environment and children. It might be tougher, but if you position your workshop here, you might start to chip away at the dominance of extrinsic values, especially if I'm doing it too, if your colleagues are doing it too, if other organisations are doing it, and if determined and sometimes a little bit rebellious teachers in that sort of school and the parents at the school are trying to do it as well. It might feel uncomfortable. You might be worried about coming over as being all woke or like a snowflake or a hippie or whatever is the popular derogatory term of the day. But remember what Tom Crompton told us earlier. Far more people, around 85% in the study Common Cause did in Greater Manchester, far more people hold intrinsic values to be important than we think. There will be children in that school who care deeply about protecting the environment and will do it regardless of whether they get a certificate, a sticker or a few extra pounds for their school. The same applies along this axis too. I've met teachers who are really keen to talk about how their school activates values along this line. If you go into a school where these values are prominent, you know, the sort traditional and hierarchical with head teachers who rule by fear, if instead of teaching in a strict and formal sort of way, you are less formal, positioning your intervention up here with an emphasis on creativity, self-efficacy, curiosity and so on, you will, in a tiny way, start to activate these values. You're giving children the freedom to use their imagination, get creative, break the rules a little bit. As a result, they might start to value these things a bit more than they previously did, and so might their teachers. So Group 1 will go through a process of actively assessing the values we are activating, and then through a process of action learning, they will practice what it means to be mindful of values when they are designing and delivering environmental education. This could involve retrofitting existing practice or maybe developing an entirely new resource or a new intervention. Group 2 is a bit different. Actually, it's a lot different. It's about testing a hypothesis. We're exploring whether education for the environment necessarily needs to be about the environment. Our hypothesis is that it doesn't, and we're already demonstrating that at Global Action Plan through programs like Goals for Good and our recent campaign, I Don't Buy It. This is how we currently think about what environmental education is. It's a Google image search. So to be accurate, it's what Google thinks environmental education is. It's not hugely controversial. Nobody's going to fall off their chair when they scroll down a page like this. When we understand environmental education to be only this sort of thing, though, we get trapped in a paradigm. As environmental educators, we're then kind of expected to stay in our lane, to teach only about environmental things. What right do we have to start educating about other things? But you don't have to stay in your lane. Reinforcing intrinsic values through any subject matter and weakening extrinsic values, again through any subject matter, strengthens the influence of intrinsic values in society. And we know from the research that this has a positive impact on our environmental behaviours, our commitment to them, and to children's well-being. If we only think of environmental education in the way that Google presents it to us, we're asking it to do a lot of the heavy lifting. We definitely need more of it, but it's unlikely to be sufficient on its own. Recognising this opens up a lot of opportunities for environmental educators and helps us to see that we have a lot of allies. A lot of people are busy activating intrinsic and inhibiting extrinsic values. Environmental education is one thing shaping our behaviour, and our behaviour has positive and negative impacts on the planet, ourselves and each other. This is obviously a simplified diagram. We're learning all the time. We're exposed to more information than any generation probably ever has been. Like environmental education, it all has an effect. Sometimes big, sometimes minuscule, but it's all affecting our behaviour. These are just some of the examples of things which impact on our behaviour. There's thousands more. Receiving more environmental education certainly strengthens its influence, but we're still being influenced by thousands and thousands of other things, all of which shape our behaviour for better or worse. It is one of the reasons the knowledge action gap exists. The problem is not really a lack of knowledge, an information deficit. It's that our environmental concerns are so often overridden by a multitude of other daily concerns that we have. So we need to back up conventional environmental learning with learning about all these other influences on our behaviour. Through learning about these helps us to work out if the behaviours they're guiding us towards truly align with our deeply held values. Are they, for example, really bringing us the life satisfaction that they promise? It was an anti-Black Friday event, so advertising is a good one to look at. Advertising and advertisers have a bigger influence on us than we probably like to admit, and it's not always a good influence, both for the planet or for our own well-being. But its influence can be reduced if we're able to learn about it. Adverts appeal to all our values, but at root, they activate and reinforce these ones the most, and they do it in quite cynical and often morally dubious ways. What is the morality of playing upon hidden weaknesses and frailties, such as our anxieties, aggressive feelings, dread of non-conformity, and infantile hangovers to sell products? Specifically, what are the ethics of businesses that shape campaigns designed to thrive on these weaknesses that they have diagnosed? These three are particularly relevant questions for us to ask as educators and environmentalists, and for that matter, as fundraisers. This is a passage from Vance Packard's book, The Hidden Persuaders, which was written in 1957. It was a head-on challenge to the advertising industry, the madmen of Madison Avenue in New York. In answer to his questions, obviously these practices are morally dubious. Packard, later in the book, he quotes advertising execs from the time admitting as much themselves. But 62 years later, this is all still going on. In fact, really, it's been turbocharged as digital marketing and social media pushes through new frontiers and gives the advertising world more platforms to work with. But it all has consequences for the environment and for mental health. Conditions like status anxiety, narcissism and affluenza are at almost epidemic levels. And I see these conditions in friends and family members, young and old, and actually in my younger self too. And it's quite disturbing when you stop and think about it, when you realise that there are people whose job it is to deliberately manufacture and play upon our anxieties just to keep us hooked on their brands. Some in the environmental movement might say, if you can't beat the advertisers, join them. Appeal to those extrinsic values. Use the same techniques as the advertisers. Nudge and incentivise people to behave environmentally however you can. For me, though, it's just as morally dubious, especially now given what we know about the impact of extrinsic values on our longer-term commitment to environmental behaviours and on our mental well-being. We don't have to accept this. We can, as educators, encourage and enable critical thinking about the tactics of advertisers, which can lead to a letting go of those self-interest, extrinsic or Black Friday values. This is education for the environment that is not necessarily about the environment. It makes us more savvy and more resilient in the face of the advertising that is aimed at us. This then weakens the influence that advertising has on our behaviour. It shrinks that arrow. And when we're more immune to the tactics of advertisers, we're less likely to buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like, to paraphrase Donella Meadows. Vance Packard's book taught me so much. I read it when I was 23. If the purpose of environmental education is to limit the negative impact and maximise the positive impact of humans on the natural world, which for me it is, then this book, which hardly mentions environmental issues at all, is probably the one piece of environmental education that changed the way I understand the world and the way I behave more than any book about the environment. This more recent book, Hypercapitalism, by Tim Kasser and Larry Gonick, is fantastic too. It's in a comic book style throughout, and it's a great resource for helping young adults to think critically about the forces that are shaping their values, attitudes and behaviours. After we've engaged with materials like this, and we hope Group 2 will come up with similar stuff, we'll still hold all the extrinsic values, but they won't be as prominent or as important to us. We'll begin to let go of them, which brings the seesaw effect into play. But education for the environment that doesn't mention the environment doesn't have to all be about trying to get people to let go of those Black Friday values. It's also about nurturing intrinsic, compassionate values. This is where we find lots of allies in the world of education. There are values-mindful environmental educators who are nurturing values like unity with nature, and this is where the overlap with Group 1 exists. But there are also English teachers, drama teachers, history teachers, who, through the characters they introduce their students to, are helping them to explore their own values by examining the values of people like Henry VIII, Atticus Finch, Florence Nightingale, or the Montagues and Capulets. At a really basic level, something like this poster from Transport for London reinforces intrinsic values. So Group 2 could come up with something as simple as this and action learn from the process of creating it and putting it out into the world. This sort of an education has this effect. It strengthens intrinsic values, further tipping the seesaw away from self-interest values that we diminished earlier by critiquing advertising. Modern day role models are also vitally important in all this. What sort of values do public figures like Andy Murray, Kate Tempest and Fern Cotton activate compared to, say, Piers Morgan, Jeremy Clarkson or any number of politicians? I won't name names. Let's just say some activate some values, others activate others. So Group 2 are answering our initial question by exploring and experimenting with a much broader definition of what education for the environment can be. GAP has been doing some of this experimentation already ourselves. I've already mentioned the I Don't Buy It campaign, which encouraged young people to call out the ludicrous promises brands make about their products and services. And through our more in-depth programmes like Goals for Good, and I really recommend you looking into that and having a look at the white paper which was written to go alongside it. We at GAP and Reboot, we want more organisations to start approaching education for the environment in this way. And we want to link up with those who are already doing it, because we know others are as well. So to summarise, there are two groups we're looking to recruit organisations to. The first group is really about the environmental education sector getting its own house in order. This is vital, not necessarily as easy as it first appears, but it would be great to have at least 5 examples of organisations who are demonstrably mindful of the values that their work activates and reinforces. Group 2 is more experimental. It will, we hope, have the effect of expanding our understandings of what education for the environment can actually be. There's no reason why you can't be involved in both groups simultaneously. Along with Reboot the Future, GAP, with some expert support, will lead on designing the project initially, and we're already seeking the funding that we're going to need to coordinate this and to allow the groups involved to have the time to be involved. We envisage the action learning process to take something like 12 or 18 months, but our longer term goals are to use the outputs from this project as best practice examples. We also want to develop an evidence base to show how nurturing intrinsic, compassionate values can benefit children, schools, and the causes we all care about. More importantly, we want to show that this approach is possible and effective so that we can inspire a movement that might, you never know, spread not just across the environmental education sector, but the education sector as a whole. If you're interested, please get in touch. We'll be circulating a call for expressions of interest in the next few weeks. We're also going to need people with expertise in this area, in values and education and so on. So if you're interested in being involved in that way, again, please get in touch. Thank you.